deal with chapters 4, 5, and 6 of The Soul of the World. And we've had a general introduction to the theme that is underlying the whole book. In these chapters, Roger applies some of the thoughts he has about cognitive dualism and the Lebenswelt, the human world, to particular areas of life. First of all, in chapter 4, to the law and rights and obligations. And he has some, I think, very interesting things to say at the end of that chapter. Then he moves on to considering the person and their face, and the way that the face reveals or fails to reveal the person who's on this transcendent edge of things, as he's said before. And then in the sixth chapter, he goes on to discuss what I will call dwelling, which involves a number of thoughts about the land where we live, and particularly architecture, about which Roger was passionate and extremely knowledgeable. A seventh chapter, which I'm not going to have time to deal with, deals with music in the same sort of spirit. But you already know, I think, some of what Roger thinks about music, and you can read that chapter for yourselves with profit. And then in the last meeting, I will try to explain how in the last chapter, Roger ties all this up with talking directly about religion, which has been in the background of most of what we've been looking at, but hasn't really been dealt with directly. And indeed, it won't be today, but again, it will be part of the groundwork for that last chapter. Now, in chapter 4, Roger is dealing with the implications of personal interaction and the obligations and rights which people have just by being in a human community. I think he's particularly talking about human communities which are subject to the rule of law. And obviously the rule of law that he particularly likes is the common law of Britain and I think the United States and other jurisdictions that follow the common law. But I think what he says does apply more generally. And the first thing to note is that he insists that the obligations which arise from the rule of law and from living under the law, at least in the kind of atmosphere in which we experience, we in the Anglosphere and places, Europe, these obligations are not the work of an oppressive power. The first move of left-wing critics of the rule of law, values of that sort, is that these are all the work of some oppressive power that's keeping everybody else down. And the oppressive power might be the bourgeoisie, it might be capitalists, it might be imperialists, all kinds of villains. But the idea is that all this is oppressive. Roger insists in the rule of law that he is interested in and talking about. He says that the world of obligation and rights, this is page 80, is not an artificial imposition designed to serve the purpose of some sovereign power, but rather the natural outgrowth of the IU encounter. And he looks at this in two ways. First of all, in terms of the agreements that we make with each other, the contracts and obligations that we put ourselves under, the promises we make, and that sort of thing. And from this, he argues, comes a calculus of rights, responsibilities, and duties, arising from our disposition to bind ourselves with firm agreements and to live with each other on terms of that sort. And he calls the rights which arise from these types of agreement, he calls them claim rights, because they give me claims on other people, and other people would have claims on me. You know, if I enter into an agreement to sell you something, and you know this is a formal thing, then I have obligations to you and you have obligations to me. So, and if these obligations are infringed, then each of us would have a claim on the other. And under the rule of law, if the worst comes to the worst, these claims could be satisfied or imposed by the law. He also talks about another form of right, which comes from the type of society that he is interested in, and he calls these freedom rights. And these are rights which allow me or you to have your freedom to live, to have property, to meet, to speak, and do all these sorts of things. And these rights, he says, are normally to be interpreted in negative terms. They're rights that stop me being killed, stop my property being taken away, stop my my freedom of expression. He does say something in discussing claim rights and freedom rights about rights inflation, which he thinks is a prominent feature of the modern world, where rights are postulated without any relation of liability. Because particularly, well, actually in both claim rights and freedom rights, these rights impose liabilities on others. And we know who is to satisfy these liabilities, but he thinks that rights get overinflated when it's unclear who is going to have the duty, which is correlative to the right, who has the responsibility of making sure that the right is satisfied. And we could look even to the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights to see examples of rights inflation at quite an early stage, where people apparently have a right to a certain standard of living. They have a right to leisure, and rather amazingly, the right to live in a society where these rights, that is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, are to be applied. And one simply asks, I mean, not that these things might not be undesirable, but the question obviously arises, who is going to impose or enforce these rights, particularly the one that says that the rights have to be enforced everywhere? And of course, the answer will be, it will be the state by taking more and more power. So rights inflation can lead to the overmighty state enforcing and regulating more and more. He also, en passant, distinguishes between an Aristotelian account of justice, where justice involves giving the other his or her due, what is owing to him or her, with the account of justice given famously in John Rawls's A Theory of Justice, which sees justice in terms of distributions and outcomes. And again, you can see that the one is going to lead to very heavy state regulation, because who else can see that the Rawlsian distributions and outcomes are satisfied, whereas the Aristotelian account looks much more like a combination of the freedom rights, the limited sort that Roger has expounded, and the claim rights which come from actual dealings with each other. But I said that I think that in some ways, the more interesting part of this chapter is where he begins to discuss what he calls non-contractual obligations, which arise from very important central aspects of the Lebenswelt, from affection, from friendship and love, from piety, and from vows. And indeed from just the fact that I have been, I owe an obligation to my parents and to the culture that has brought me up. Now, he thinks that in the vow I might make, and he sees marriage in terms of vows, not contracts, there are no limits, and there are transcendent sacramental dimensions, as he puts it. Love, he thinks, is a non-transferable attachment to this person only, and again, it's something that goes beyond anything enforceable by law. So again, it has a kind of transcendent element to it. Piety, he sees in terms of obligations which arise from no agreement, but are independent of our desires and the reasons that we might give from a personal way. He thinks that these things, which he sums up on page 94, are crucial to the Lebenswelt, and he distinguishes these non-contractual obligations and what he thinks about them from what Hobbes says in Leviathan, and indeed what many modern philosophers would say. So on page 92, sorry, not 94, 92, he says that in Leviathan, Thomas Hobbes defended a social contract theory of political obligation on the ground that, quote from Hobbes, a man is under no obligation that ariseth not from some act of his own. So in other words, all obligations are contractual in Hobbes's view, and they all come from preferences and choices, preferences I have and choices that I've made. This idea, Roger says, has a long subsequent history. It seems to justify political obedience in the same terms as justify the keeping of promises, namely that citizens put themselves under the obligation to obey. But surely, and this is the key point about the non-contractual obligations, it is evident that some of the most important of our obligations are not undertaken in this way. For example, the obligation to parents. And on page 94, he goes on to give some more examples. These non-contractual obligations are marked by two features, he says: their long-term social function and their lack of internal plasticity. Vows of marriage, obligation towards parents and children, sacred ties to home and country. Such things have to be rescued from the corrosions of the will, made inflexible and eternal if they are to perform their manifest function of securing society against the forces of selfish desire. And he adds, leading on to a religious thought, it is hardly surprising, therefore, if they are wound into the eternal order of things by moments of sacrificial awe. So over and above the standard sense of rights and agreements and duties and obligations, which we find in standard political philosophy, Roger is emphasizing the extent to which within the Lebenswelt, if it's properly understood, there are obligations, duties, and a sense of what ought to be done, which go beyond any of that. Piety, love, vows. And he thinks that these features ought to play a large part in our lives together. And I'll come back to this again in a minute. In chapter 5, he engages in a long meditation on the face, the human face. The face as being that by which we primarily show ourselves, or sometimes hide ourselves, to each other as subjects. And from behind the face, as it were, we address the world from our own horizon, and you from your horizon. And the subject is in the face. And although he doesn't say very much about it here, Roger does have some regard for Sartre and for Sartre's notion of le regard, which of course for Sartre is often a somewhat sinister thing, but the way in which, when we see that another person is observing us, we behave differently from if we think we're on our own. Just the mere fact that we're in the presence of le regard, we then are shaken into a whole different attitude. And of course, Sartre sees particularly shame in these terms. Roger doesn't disagree with that, though he thinks it's a positive thing, not the negative thing which Sartre seems to see it as. Le regard, one of his examples, Sartre's examples, is when I'm doing something dishonorable and then I notice that somebody else is watching me, spying on me through a keyhole, and then that transforms the whole situation. Now, the face for Roger is where we find the subject, where we interact subjectively with other people and not as mere objects. And I think that there is an echo here in what Roger says with Strawson, P.F. Strawson, Peter Strawson, in his article Freedom and Resentment. And I'll just read you a somewhat gnomic passage from Roger, pages 103 to 4. He says, I am inclined to the view that there is no answer to the question, what makes me the individual that I am, that is not a trivial assertion of identity. A trivial assertion maybe, but the fact isn't trivial. I am also inclined to the view that the notion of an absolute individuality arises spontaneously from the most fundamental interpersonal relations. It is implied in all our attempts at integrity and responsible living, and it is built into our way of perceiving as well as our way of describing the human world. Rather than dismiss it as an illusion, I would prefer to say that it is a well-founded phenomenon in Leibniz's sense, a way of seeing the world that is indispensable to us and which we could never have conclusive reason to reject. That's the kind of Strawsonian point, never have conclusive reason to reject. And in going on to develop this notion of the face and the subject, Roger inveighs against treating others as mere objects. And he writes strongly against objectifying sexual relationships, which he sees not as something just for pleasure or just that could be sold, bought and sold, or just a temporary contract. He sees this sexual relationship as an existential choice, which is surrounded or ought to be surrounded by prohibitions. And he points out that in all human societies, except perhaps our own, it is surrounded by prohibitions. And he thinks, rightly so, not necessarily that prohibitions are right, but that because that focuses our attention on the understanding of the existential meaning of when we engage in sexual relations with other people, and how this can be a source of sacred interaction or of desecration, a source of love or a source of shame, and so on and so forth, which he thinks would be wiped out if we simply saw these things in purely transactional terms. He then goes on to talk about the Hegelian view of all of this, human freedom, human subjectivity. Hegel sees us as arising, human beings that is, as arising originally from an undifferentiated union with the world. This is before we become self-conscious. But then through interaction with objects and others with whom we are competing, we then find the world is full of objects, not just me, so I'm not completely unified with the world. I am in a world that has an objective existence that impinges on me and imposes on me, and I feel alienated from that world. That's Hegelian alienation. But then through human community, I get reconciled to the other and the world through seeing the other people with whom I'm competing, not as objects, but as subjects with whom I'm reconciled and with whom I then live in community as a free subject. So this is a typical Hegelian dialectic. You go from original unity through self-consciousness and objectification, but a kind of competing, alienated objectification into a higher level of unity through a community with which I interact with other free beings, free like myself. Now, Roger thinks that this Hegelian picture is extremely powerful, as indeed do I, and there's a lot of truth in it. But he thinks that it's fundamentally a myth, because the original consciousness of myself I couldn't have unless I already existed in a world, in a community of others with whom I am interacting freely. This is a bit like the private language argument, that I can't know myself without knowing myself as already in a community of others who are also subjects. So Roger interprets the Hegelian myth as something that tells us truths, deep truths about our existence, but he says we shouldn't see it in terms of a myth of origin, but rather as something which explains or adumbrates a kind of dynamic that's always there, or, you know, from the beginning. He also would see the Christian myth of original sin in those terms, and Adam and Eve and so on. Don't look at that in terms of something that happened in the distant past. It's something that is there all the time, and what it tells us is a truths about original sin, about how we can overcome that, about the need for grace, and so on and so forth, things which are always there and always in our lives. So again, he sees this Hegelian story about the way that we come to freedom through recognizing others as equally free. He says that this takes us back to cognitive dualism. So we're living now in a world of free beings with faces who interact with us and we with them. And at the end of the chapter, he slaps down Sellers for Wilfrid Sellers, who, you remember, made this distinction between the manifest image and the scientific image, for giving the scientific image primacy. For Roger, as for me, the real presence, to use a sacramental term, the real presence of the person, that's his term, the real presence of the person is deeper. So now we move on to chapter 6, Facing the Earth, it's called. Chapter 5 is about how persons operate in the Lebenswelt. This chapter, and there are some very beautiful moments in it, is about how place is humanized and how we introduce place into the Lebenswelt and how we dwell in it. Now, we can look at all this historically in terms of how in Paleolithic and Neolithic times, people, human beings, primeval human beings, started to form settlements and then live in towns and cities, which archaeologists date to around 10,000 to 8,000 BC in the Neolithic time. This story about how we humanize the world is often hedged about by myths of origin. And the famous one is, of course, I say of course, sorry, it's a terrible habit of mine, Virgil's Aeneid. So in the Aeneid, this is the story of how the Trojans come to Rome. The Trojans whose city has been brutally destroyed by the iniquitous Greeks, how they're told by the gods, or Aeneas is told by the god, to found a new city, a new Troy. And so he has all these adventures that are recounted in the Aeneid, and then he plants the new Troy in Latium, near Rome. And so then Troy becomes Rome. And this is sanctified by the gods. This is a divine mission that Aeneas has. The point about this story from Roger's point of view is the way that the foundation of Rome is given a transcendent religious meaning by the myth. And when we look at the myths which surround human origins, they are all about settlement, the acquisition of fire, hunting animals, family life, tending crops, farming. These activities which distinguish the human from the animal and make chaos out of chaos, make cosmos and settlement. And these myths then would associate with fire, crop tending, animal hunting and so on, family life, all these things. They would associate them with gods in the myths. And you can easily see that in, I'm not going to go into detail, but in the, this is one reason why it's nice to think of Rome in these terms, because there are gods for all these things. And these myths, and also humans, see the place where tribes live, Latium, Rome, as bestowed on them by the gods, whom the tribe then honors with household gods and, crucially, temples. Temples being the place or places where we both symbolize our own dwelling and from the edge of our lives connect with the transcendent powers to which we owe our life and place. So he sees the temple as a fundamental element of any decent human settlement. And I mean, it's not just that he sees it. Actually, nearly all, I can't think of any that don't, any early or even later societies that don't have, in one way or another, temples where they give thanks or honor the divine powers from whom they think that they have received their place of dwelling. And on page 124, Roger describes the temple, of course he's now describing a classical temple, as not simply a work of load-bearing stone. The column is carved, fluted, adorned with plinth and capital, crowned by a frieze or an arch, or joined in heavenly vaults where stone achieves the lightness of the sky. Through moldings and decorative details, the stone is filled with shadow, acquires a translucent appearance, as the face is translucent to the spirit within. So the temple is like the face of the god, in a way, like just as our faces are the face of what is within us, the transcendent aspect that's within us. And then after page 124, he gives a long extract from his pseudo-Platonic dialogue, Perictione and Colophon, in which he explains how the classical architectural arch provides a sympathetic frame for a community living together and transforming mere stones and earth into a dwelling. And having mentioned Sartre, I will now mention Heidegger, or on Roger's behalf, because Roger also mentions Heidegger, with Heidegger's talk of dwelling and the importance of humans living, dwelling in a place, not just being in somewhere that they just are there temporarily and show no regard for, dispose of it as they want. And to go back to the temple, which symbolizes our living and, symbolizes our dwelling more than just living and surviving. He contrasts the type of city in which people lived before modern architecture with modern architecture, which repudiates, according to him, all the features which make both city and home replete with human meaning. So I quoted or mentioned Hobbes earlier, where Hobbes is making everything into a contract. Everything that we should treat with respect and awe and piety into a contract. Roger, I think, sees modern architecture, and you know what he means, the type of architecture advocated by Leurs and Le Corbusier and Mies van der Rohe, as turning dwellings back into mere objects. So any sense of that goes beyond contract in the political economic sense, in modern architecture, any sense that the buildings can go beyond mere machines is obviously eliminated in modern architecture. Indeed, Le Corbusier talks about machines for living in. So modern architecture, in Roger's view, makes what should be transformed by, I'm going to say, spiritual concerns and aspirations into objects for use and barter. And on page 134, he contrasts modern faceless architecture, plate glass, rectangular, no shade, no moldings, no depth. He contrasts it with vernacular architecture. Vernacular architecture, he says, from all periods and places, has adapted to the human need for home and settlement, and in each case evolved some local variant of the standing posture, the smiling surface, and the fractal order common to growing things. Yeah, we could talk about fractal orders and growing things later if you like. In the classical tradition, these aesthetic constants are digested into grammar to become generative principles of indefinitely many pleasing shapes and forms. The implied order retains the calm and unobtrusive background of shapes that were, according to the myth, lifted out of our nature and consecrated to the spirit. It is the visible license to dwell, the affirmation of our right of occupation, and the reminder that our communities precede and survive us. So he says, basically, that in these three chapters, that we human beings have a desire to be at home in the world and with each other. We live in face-to-face encounters with each other, in which there are duties, obligations, and feelings which transcend mere desire, mere choice, mere preference. We interact with other people as if they are not objects, but as subjects. And ideally, we should bring into our surroundings this also the features which provide the world itself as with a face. On page 137, he says, in the aesthetic experience, and he sees architecture very much in terms of aesthetic experience, we have something like a face-to-face encounter with the world itself, with the things that it contains, just as we have in the experience of sacred things and sacred places. And he goes on to say that on page 137, in the turning for home, we design our surroundings, we bring them from within the sphere of accountability to others and theirs to us. And in that sense, we are providing the world with a face. We deface the world when we scribble me all over it and invite others to do the same. And he sees modern architects particularly as scribbling me all over the world. You know, it's me, look what I've done in that way. Beauty is the face of the community, and ugliness the attack on that face by the solipsist and the scavenger. And he adds, and he could have said a lot more about this, that the ecological movement, the environmental movement, can and indeed should be seen in terms of an attempt to see the world in terms not of something just to be used and disposed of, but in terms of a dwelling and in terms of a landscape, a world which we have to treat with respect, just as we have to treat each other with respect. And this is what the good aspect which underlies the environmental movement. And he goes on to discuss that at great length in the book called green philosophy. And I think I can sum up what's important about these 3 chapters in the last sentence of chapter 6. What is revealed to me, in the experience of beauty, is a fundamental truth about being, that being is a gift. So he sees persons, the face, the world, everything that surrounds us in terms of a gift, which we should treat in that way and not simply to be used and disposed of according to our desires. And that, of course, will take us into chapter 8, Seeking God, which is where we will go in a fortnight. So, thank you.